Okay, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to our webinar, Level Up Your Teaching with Games. I think people are still getting in. So we can just start with the introduction. We are all very pleased to see you all here. We are organizing this webinar within the scope of a project entitled Play and Learn English, Gamifying Language Teaching and Designing Game-Based Language Activities. The project is carried out by Alparslan University ELT department and funded by US Embassy Ankara. Our project aims to enhance English language teachers' capacity of using games in language teaching through training, webinars, and a MOOC, and contribute to their professional development. We are going to organize monthly webinars till September, and this is the first of our webinars. Welcome again. And by the way, let me also tell this, as part of this project, we are also providing face-to-face trainings. And these trainings will take place very soon at the campus of Alparslan University. And we still have some space for new applicants. So interested English teachers can still apply on our website, gamifyenglish.com, which is also, you can see on the background. Before I give stage to Jeff, let me introduce you the project team. Dr. Yusuf Öztürk and Dr. Sabahattin Yeşilçınar, they are project coordinators, and they are faculty members at the Alparslan University ELT department. And we have also Dr. Fevzi İnan Dönmez. He is also our IT expert in this project. Mostly he will be helping us in creating the MOOC and other technology-related activities. And my name is Samet Yasin Öztürk. I am a research assistant at ELT department here in Muş. And I am also working as the project assistant here in this project. And let me say a few words about our American partner and distinguished presenter today, Dr. Jeffrey Kuhn. He is holding a PhD from Instructional Technology Department from Ohio University. And he's an instructional designer in the Office of Instructional Innovation and staff at the Games Research and Immersive Design Lab at Ohio University. And he's an expert in designing and using games in language classrooms. And he will be talking about his things today. So Jeff, so the floor is yours.
All right, thanks. And thanks everyone for attending tonight. I hope everybody's having a good evening and ready to talk some games. Before we get going, I do want to say, thank you to, Alparslan University and the U.S. Embassy in Turkey for, hosting this event and for, getting to be a part of it. It's great to be able to reach out and talk to other teachers about using games and, thinking about ways to increase the presence of games in the classroom. And so, for my parents who thought that me playing video games as a kid wouldn't mean anything, it's great to be able to say that, no, I have a job where I get to talk about games to people around the world. So this is always fun for me. And, I hope everybody, learns something along the way and uses this as a chance to kind of share information. I think one of the great aspects of these presentations is that as I'm sharing ideas, the teachers that attend also are sharing information with me. And so we get to kind of learn collectively. So please, feel free to share ideas in the chat. And, at the end of the presentation, we've got, time for some questions and we can throw some ideas around. And more importantly, think about some of the ideas and some of the questions that come up during today's talk as a way to start developing ideas for, the workshop series and for the webinars that will continue through, until September. So I hope really today it's a chance to start a conversation versus just, having a presentation and finishing it for today. And so, as Smed mentioned earlier, we've got the, let me see if I can do my, the Gamify English, website. So, check that out and, be involved in these webinars and have the conversations with fellow teachers, and let's see what we can create together along the way. And so as we start in on, the presentations here, I'll share my screen here. Let me make sure I've got my screen sharing privileges. Let's see here. Oh, I cannot share my screen. Can I get screen sharing turned on there?
Let me see.
Let me see. I think it's in there somewhere. And so, while we're doing that, really today's talk, thinking about how to use games, a couple of things I'll do along the way is first, you'll notice I don't really distinguish between like a board game or a card-based game and a video game. I think, games have a lot of similar characteristics. And so depending on your teaching context, what works for you may not work for the next teacher. So I try to have some flexibility in the presentation. And then also the other aspect that, I want to think about here is how it's really difficult to recommend a specific game for an educator. I'll get questions frequently about, well, what game should I use in my classroom? And the answer is, I don't know. I don't know your teaching context. I don't know your students. So it's really hard to kind of recommend specific things, but at least recommending, kind of best practices and things that we can think about. So again, this presentation being more of a broad overview of the ways we can think about games for the rest of the webinar series. So, with that in mind, we'll kind of move forward. And, the big question that maybe we're all looking to answer right now is, why use games in the classroom? And the simple answer is language teachers have always used games. I think, compared to some other subjects that we have, math or history or science, language learning and games go really well together. There was some research back in 2012. Young and his colleagues looked at different fields of study, different subject areas and games, and found that the strongest results were when games were used in the language classroom. And I think one of the reasons that really works is because whoa, my lights just went out in my office. Hold on. Luckily, my power did not go out, but our university has motion sensing lights. Whoops, sorry about that. But we're all fixed. And in games, just like that, things can sometimes go wrong. I think one of the great parts about games is they allow failure. They allow students to explore and experiment. And sometimes they get it wrong. Sometimes they get it right. And I think that's a really important part of why we should use games in the class, because students get to think about, if I do this, these decisions they get to make and see what happens when those decisions get made. Sometimes they work and sometimes they fail. And that ability to think flexibly really fosters language, fosters that communicative output that we're looking for as language teachers. And as I like to say, and we'll hear later on in the presentation as well, it's not really the game that gets the students talking. The student interacts with the game. That's not really necessarily what we want. But when students are engaged in gameplay and they start communicating with one another, talking about what they did or why they did it. And so how do we kind of foster that component of gameplay where we get students talking around the game? And like I said at the beginning here, with games, it really depends on our teaching context, what kind of technology we have, the technology literacy of ourselves and our students. So, you may be someone who loves playing video games and knows some great video games to bring in your classroom, like, the game Among Us, which is this, you have to find the spy amongst a group of people, and it's a lot of social guessing. But there's also card games that are just like that, games like the Resistance or the Coup. So you might be able to get a card game from a local game store, or order it online or something like that. Or maybe you just don't have access to these things, so you just do it yourself with pen and paper. So really don't worry about technology. I think one of the big challenges I see with using games in the class is how quickly we'll tie gameplay to technology, when really, if we have a fun, immersive, space with lots of decision making for students, the same characteristics in gameplay will come out. And so do what you can with the resources you have, is always my thought with gameplay, because you can always find a game or a style of game that works for you and your students. So kind of keep that in mind as well. And then, finally, this is something I think is really interesting from Davis in 2014, where, what game do I use in my class? How do we choose that game? And really just kind of think it through based on, what your students are looking for, what you're looking for in your class is really important. So, older students, if you're teaching, high school age students or above, older players like challenges and multiple levels. They like big storylines, they like a plot or something like that. How do we make our game personable? How do we give our students rewards as they go through a game? And how can we use the game to provide feedback on our students' performance in the game? These are things we want to think about and kind of measure out. For younger learners, if you're a primary school teacher, these aren't as important. But for older students, these start to become very important. So kind of ask yourself, what are the criteria that you want, or that your students want from a game? And that can really help us in the selection process. This also comes from a colleague, Dave Dodgson, who taught in Turkey quite a ways back. And Dave highlighted out some of these things that we can think about with choosing a game in the class. And if you're thinking about a game to use, start a conversation with students. Kind of first question, do they want to learn with games? When it's exam time, it's exam season at school, maybe games aren't the best. Students like, no, got to focus on the exam, only exam related information. But if it's a different time of year, students aren't thinking about university exams or something like that, it's a great time to bring games in the classroom. And then just start brainstorming. Students can list the type of games they enjoy, or the type of games they want to play. And then, kind of the rules. My particular rule, no shooting. So no Call of Duties or any sort of those type of video games in my class, obviously. I want something that's very language focused. My students may love a game, but I'm like, the language value isn't there. So we're not going to play that game. And then finally, we take that list, students get a choice, you get to choose. Then finally, thinking about, okay, well, which of the games that we highlighted fit into our curriculum, fit into our lesson plan? So kind of keeping those ideas in mind can really be a great way to kind of move the conversation forward about picking the right game for your class. And then once we kind of have the idea of, my students want to use a game in the class, I want to use the game in the class, how do I make space in my classroom for a game? So this next part is a little more kind of focused on our methodology and pedagogy versus just, games themselves. But, a great place to begin with games is really thinking about what takes the majority of my class time. If you've ever seen the learning pyramid here, the basic idea is when students sit and have a lecture, they may remember about 5% of what they're taught during a lecture. A demonstration, students retain about 30% of what they have learned. But if I'm teaching someone else, I often retain upwards of 90% of what I've learned. And so, thinking about that in class, well, most of my class is a lecture. I do a lot of lecturing in class. So how do I fit games into a class that's mostly lecture based? Or I do a lot of hands-on activity in my class, a lot of demonstrations and discussions. Where can I fit a game in? So starting with kind of an analysis of how you teach, maybe what are the requirements, given by, here in America, it's the states that determine our teaching, or if it's the national government, what do they require in a classroom? And just kind of recognizing our realities and what we have to do in a class is really important in order to set ourselves up for success. And something else I really like to discuss, you can go to tpac.org and read more about this, but the general idea with the TPAC model is, we have pedagogy and we have content knowledge, how we teach and what we teach, and those influence each other. What TPAC suggests is when we bring, technology into the classroom, that changes our pedagogy and that changes our content. And I like to think about this, with games. I do a lot with video games in the class. So for me, when I bring that technology component in the digital game, it must change my pedagogy and it must change my content. If I'm a lecturer, someone who lectures a lot in my classroom, recognizing that bringing games into the class is going to require I change a little bit. I lecture less and have students do more hands-on activity. So think about that as well. Ask yourself, if I bring a game into my classroom, a bigger game, maybe a longer game than just a quick activity, how must I change, and how must the way my content gets delivered in my classroom must change? So kind of something to think about as we move through, this webinar series and learning components here. Other things to think about is, how much direct instruction can my students take? For adults, we can typically go 15 to about 18 minutes where we get direct instruction. And after that, we just, people just start to kind of lose attention, and check their phone these days. So, think about that with your class. Like, hey, I lecture, but I should really keep my lectures to 20 minutes. I've got a 50-minute class. If I lecture for 20 minutes, maybe there's a half an hour in there I can use a game in my class. So kind of thinking about that too, of how old are your learners? And then that gives you a chance to kind of think about how much active learning you may want to have in the class versus that direct, kind of lecture-based instruction that we may see in a traditional classroom. And then finally, kind of this last component here, I think is really important for thinking about, using games in the classroom, is this notion of backward design. A common stumbling point, a common block that I see with using games in the classes, and this is something I did early on, was I pick a game. My students love this game. I'm going to use this in class. But there really wasn't a clear connection to my course goals. So the students didn't quite understand why we were playing it, and it didn't really fit into my grading. It would just seem to be a fun diversion. So my students treated it like that. Wasn't really, critical, so they didn't really treat it as critical. But instead, as I shifted towards this notion of backwards design, which really says, I'm going to pick a course goal. How will my students be different at the end of my course? Final assessment. How will I know my students have changed? How will I know they have met that goal? And then I started doing my learning outcomes based on that. Okay, well, here's what my students must be able to do to complete the final assessment successfully, to show that they learned the course goals. And only then did I start thinking about the games that would best fit in my classroom as a homework or as a learning activity. And I could say, okay, we're going to use this game because it connects to this learning goal. The skills they develop in the game are going to be part of the final assessment. And I know if they complete that final assessment successfully, they've achieved our course goals. And so, really kind of think carefully, look through your syllabi, look through your lesson plans, and start to identify where those strong learning outcomes are, and say, okay, here's a game that fits that learning objective, or, the learning outcome. So as, kind of a quick summary of this backward design is, what are your expectations? Be sure those are clear. Define that evidence of learning in that final assessment, and then choose the game that, capital letters, show students can show that evidence where we can very clearly make that connection. And for me, this was really important in getting my administrators and, my supervisors to start accepting games more in the classroom. When I could say, yeah, we were playing that game and it looked very messy, but my students did this, this, and this, and they're all connected to the learning goal. That's when I started getting acceptance from, my administrators at my university. So, this can really kind of help us justify games in the classroom as well. And, finally, this last part, talking about those, learning outcomes, really thinking about tying them to clear, strong verbs. So this is Bloom's taxonomy. I'm sure many people have seen it here where, if my learning objective is some, remembering, I just need my students to remember past tense of verbs because the exam is coming up. And I'm using verbs like students will be able to memorize, or students will be able to reproduce, students will be able to define. Maybe not a good fit for a classroom because those verbs are kind of down at the remembering section of Bloom's taxonomy. So I'm going through the rest of my learning outcomes and I see, I want my students to create. I want them to assemble or construct, evaluate, analyze, judge, or defend. Now, those verbs kind of at the top of Bloom's taxonomy can really make a good place for games. So again, thinking about your learning outcomes that are stated in your, syllabi, and then kind of using that, what game lets my students create, or what lets my students argue or defend, and kind of identifying those, as a way to kind of start with games in the classroom. Whether that's a board game, whether it's a card game or a video game. So, with that in mind, kind of thinking a little more specifically about games, what is it that games do well, and why should we use them? And so, for those of you who play games and are fond of games, there's a quote that I like from a researcher, Ian Bogos, and he says, games are really models of experiences rather than textual descriptions. And I think that's really powerful to think about. If we think about our traditional, classroom material, books and movies, music, we can watch a movie like Titanic 10 times and it never changes, right? So the movie never changes no matter how many times I watch it. But with a video game, it can change. What if, Titanic, the video game, happened, and at the end of it, I could choose, whether Jack lives or whether Jack dies. And if you haven't seen Titanic, sorry, I just spoiled the movie for you. But this idea of choice, students can make a choice and see the results of that choice. Each time they make a different choice, each time the game changes a little bit, and that makes them really fundamentally different compared to, like I said, movies or music or books. So, I can make a choice and I could turn to Yusuf and say, what did you choose? And Yusuf says, I chose this. And in that communication, hey, you did this and I did this. What are the differences? Again, fosters that communication. So, when I go through possible games in my class, I really think about that. Are my students getting to make choices that are meaningful? And then being able to discuss and talk about those choices is really important. And that ability to make choices really creates, video games, digital games, card games, whatever you may want, something that's really engaging. It's a very engaging space. And then there's language learning. And, one of my mistakes early on was I thought I put my students in a game, we're going to play this board game, and it's really engaging, and they're going to communicate. Language will just happen. And my mistake was I didn't think about the teacher's role in this. I thought the game would do the work for me, and it just wasn't true. As Bukowski 2012 says, what we're really needing to do is find our students' curiosity and motivation. What parts of games and what aspects of them do they like? And I've got to shape that into something. I got to think about, how do I take my students' curiosity, shape that into a problem that can be presented through a game, and then get my students to communicate. And so Games without teacher guidance and without the curiosity and motivation of our students just aren't going to be successful. And so, as a friend of mine, Jonathan Dahan, researcher at a university in Japan, talks, we often think about what the game does, but what we really should be doing as teachers is thinking about what we're doing around the game. How am I setting up learning experiences around the game? And so I hope, through the workshop series, everybody's thinking about that. Like, what is my role in using this game to create an experience for my students where language will occur? So how do we do that? There's some ways that we can kind of go about doing that. And so we'll take a look at some examples, just 3 big, broad examples that we could start to use as a way to experiment and play around with using games. And so, as I mentioned earlier, as the summer continues, we can, play with these ideas and develop these ideas out during this, workshop series. So this is one that I really like from a colleague, James York. And I think James does a really good job of setting up what students should be doing around the game versus just the game itself. And James uses a lot of board games in his class. He's a teacher at a university in Japan, Meiji University now in Japan. So what James does is he starts with a board game and he'll have his students read the rule book. May find that online, or he may have a copy that he gives to students, but they start with a reading activity. They're reading how to play the game. They're checking vocabulary, kind of learning the rules of the game. And then what he does is he'll have them watch a video. So he has them go online and find a video of people playing that game. And so now it's become a listening activity. And while students are reading the rule book and they're watching the video, he'll have them list the vocabulary that is important to the game. So they'll list the English word, and in this case, they'll list the Japanese translation, so their native language translation there. So that way they know, okay, here are the key words. So he's really prepared them to play the game. So they know the rules, they know how it's played, they know the basic terms and terminology. Only then, after that kind of pre-work, does he have the students play the game. So then they come to class and they'll actually spend time in class playing the game. Everybody knows the rules. But what I think is really kind of interesting about James and his approach is while students play the game, he'll record them. So the gameplay, there's an audio recording, and then students have to listen to the audio recording and do a transcription exercise after they've played the game. So now they've got, this transcription of the gameplay, and they have to go in and check their grammar and make corrections to their grammar mistakes. So now they're really focusing on their own language. He prepared them to be successful in the game. Then they played the game, and now they're going to correct their language. And so it became this way of just getting a natural conversation out of the students, and then a way for them to, kind of be mindful of their own language and ways that they can kind of correct their own language. So again, he's really thinking about what students are doing around the game versus just playing the game. And so, without that kind of support and that scaffolding, students may not have the success that we're hoping for when they play the game. Other ways that we can think about a game is just as like a problem space. I can share the link. This is a pre-made activity that I made for the American English website, and I can share it in the chat after the talk. But one that's really popular in my class is, it's Stranded on the Moon, right? So basic idea is you're in a spaceship going to the moon and it crashes. You've got some survival equipment on board the spaceship. Now you have to get from the crash site to your moon base. It's about 80 kilometers. What items do you take with you and why? So students can list the items they think are the most important. So, we definitely need oxygen and we need water. But what else do they need, and how creative can they be? Where, again, it's a problem space. This idea of students are going to have to get together and make choices, Not all those choices are easy. Some of the choices are difficult, but letting them just solve that problem as a group. And so something like this can be paired really well with like a graphic organizer, where students list the item that they think they should take as a group, why they should take it, and then the students debate the pros and cons of, taking certain equipment, not taking certain equipment. We should take water because we need it to drink, but water is also very heavy, so it's difficult to transport. Those sorts of things where you're giving students just this chance to stretch their creative muscles and think about a context. So not only can games just be very kind of rule-based board game or a video game, something like that, they can also just be these more kind of vague problem spaces where you give students a chance to be creative and make creative solutions to a problem. Other ones that are a great example, this is a video game based scenario. One of my colleagues here at Ohio University did. This is an American game called the Oregon Trail, and 200 years ago, people in America traveled across the West to get to like California and Oregon, and it was a very difficult trip for people to make. So in this game, you're going in a little wagon across the United States, and each day you have to make choices. How much food should people eat? Should you stop? How do you take care of your animals? A little fun-based game where people get to make difficult choices. So my colleague would have his students write a diary. Each day they wrote what they did and what the choices they made during the trip in this little video game. And so as they went, they're basically doing a little writing activity, and then they got to share. So, I could turn to Sabahat and say, what did you do on this day? And he says, oh, I did this and it wasn't so successful, but I fixed it and I moved on. I said, oh, I tried this and one of my cows didn't make it, got lost, and now I have less food. And so again, these little problems, these little challenges they can do. But what I thought was very clever about my colleague's approach was then he took the students' diaries and then he had students read real excerpts, real historical documents of people who traveled the real Oregon Trail. So they could see their video game diary and then go read a real diary and kind of compare and contrast, and see how life really was on the trail. So, there's a lot of great, more digitally based games out there where they're connected to real historical events. And so students can, have an experience that they wouldn't normally have, and then compare their kind of game experience to those who experienced it in real life. So that can be kind of a great way to stretch, game-based content out to give students, a perspective. What is life like for another person or other groups of people from different parts of the world? And so, thinking about that as well, connecting it to real events. There's a whole area of games called serious games. And what they mean by serious games is they're games designed to teach about, historical concepts or, the life experience of people in other parts of the world. That can be really a great way for students, again, to experience the way other people, live life. Other things you can do, this is another video game based example, but one that I think is very interesting is there's lots of games out there where you can build a city. Games like Sim City, or one is called City Skylines. And one of the great things about these is some of these games are pretty old, from like 2000, maybe 1999. And so now they're available for free online, and you can just play through a web browser. So you could play these on phones, you could play these on tablets or computers, depending on your technology resources. But, you build your little city, and these can be fun ways to get students into a group. Put students in a group of about 7 students and say, all right, you have to build this city and you have to make choices for the city. Decide what's best for the city or what's not good for the city, and debate and have a discussion. And these compare really well with what are called raft activities. Raft is where you give students a role and you provide them an audience, and then you have them do an activity based on a format, and have them address a specific topic. So my students are kind of building one of these cities in a video game, and then they have to take on the role of a government council, city council member, as we have here in the United States. So you're going to be a city council person. You're going to address the rest of your student group, the other 6 members of your group, in a speech format, and you have to argue for them to adopt your recycling program. Something like that, where students wouldn't normally get this experience, but now they have this chance to kind of, have a very small version of an experience and then take on a role. So kind of assuming different identities, or giving them something that's a little more focused, versus just saying, talk and solve a problem or debate. We can really kind of give them some very narrow definitions about what kind of debate, what they should talk about and why, to foster that language and that language communication. So again, we can do something that's very much like a present, practice, produce, like we saw with James's approach to board games. We can see, games as a problem space where you just give students a problem and ask them to solve it, like we saw with that the moon exercise, or with the Oregon Trail version. There is a context, a way for students to pretend to be in a different environment and to assume different roles, or something like this where it's a little more focused and we have a result that we can get out of it. And these pair really well with different ways of thinking about grading our classes, and our students' activities, where we might really want to shift to a more rubric-based grading system, right? I think one of the most powerful things about using games is, as we saw at the beginning of the talk, failure is something that's accepted in games. We make mistakes, but we can fix them. That doesn't really go well with a traditional numerical grading or A, B, C, D type of grading system. But something like with a rubric, my students are going to give a presentation and argue in that raft activity. I might do a rubric-based grading. Okay, your vocabulary was great, the correctness of language was strong, but your fluency wasn't very good. It's very flat. So little, L2 intonation patterns there. So your English intonation was off. And students can see that, through a rubric, they can see where they made mistakes. And then ideally with kind of a gamified class, students get the rubric, they see where they made mistakes, and they can try again to try to boost their score. Giving students a chance to look at that feedback, make changes, and try it again goes really well with games. Giving students multiple opportunities to try until they develop mastery is very important. So if we can tie, portfolio-based, assessment, rubric-based assessment into our, game-based learning, or games in the classroom, can really kind of help students understand, again, why they're doing it and how it ties back to the course goals and learning objectives that we have, listed for our course as well. So, with that in mind, there's lots of different ways we can do this. We talked about, specifically kind of, board games and digital games in here, but also more of those traditional classroom-based activities, for classroom games, thinking creatively about how we can use things like role playing, or, think, pair, share activities, or, even like inquiry-based learning, and getting students more opportunities to kind of try different things and make mistakes, see what the consequences are of those mistakes, and try again, is really what we think of when we think of using games in the classroom. So even if you're someone who maybe doesn't play a lot of games, you don't play many video games, or you don't play many board games, you can still use these kind of traditional classroom activities, but thinking about ways to open them up with more, kind of game techniques is something else you can think about, during the workshop series, and ways that we can change things and make some improvements and make some differences. And so, kind of the big broad ideas there to discuss. And so, with those in mind, I really kind of did want to open it up for questions and discussions, because I always think that's an important part of these, conversations. And so with that, I've got, a couple of references there, and I'll share the presentation so everybody can have a copy of it. But, if you'd like to learn more, these are some great references to take a look at. And so I just got that there. to say thanks, and thanks for listening. I'm really looking for the conversation here. So, if you've got questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If you just want to chat because it's late at night and I don't know, maybe you don't want to wake people up. But if you have a chance to turn on your mic and start, the conversation that way, please do so. I'd love to talk with everybody here. And so I'm gonna stop sharing that and jump back out to the big screen. And looks like there's already a question in the chat. Right.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeff, for this wonderful and informative presentation. It was great, and it included a lot of practical ideas for teachers and for prospective teachers and everyone. Thank you very much. Now, as Jeff said, we are at the question and answer stage. You can write down your questions in the Q&A session below, also in the chat box. There is one question actually from one listener. She says, thanks a lot for that great presentation. My question is it possible to adopt a single game for all grades or all skills?
Yeah, I think, there's always that, the work involved. I think something that I used to do that was helpful, but it was required some work from me was I used to use index cards, and I would use yellow, red, and green index cards for low, intermediate, and advanced students. And so when I had a game, instead of, I would basically change out the vocabulary. So I'd have kind of the rules for my game with different language levels in it. So I would use, the academic word lists, and based on my students' levels, I would have slightly different versions of the game. So I think, yes, you can have things for all grade levels, but often that requires us as the teachers to make, multiple versions of the same game. But I think it's worth it. One of the nice parts about games is once you've made it, it's ready to go forever. You can keep using it over and over and over. So, I made myself a set of games, like I said, based on, lower level, advanced level, and high level students, vocabulary, and that was super helpful. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff. And two more questions, but two of them actually touch on the same point. So it's related to this classroom management problem due to crowded classrooms. The listeners are wondering how they can overcome this challenge when the classroom is overpopulated.
Yeah, and I think there, with bigger classes, sometimes you have 70 students in a class. It can be really difficult to play one kind of big game. But I've seen, examples where, thinking about, small groups and doing almost like a group think, pair, share. So I've got 10 groups. They're all going to play separately. And then the groups will compare their results with another group. And then we have a big group discussion. Lots of classroom management that requires, but and it brings up one of the challenges using games is the first time you use a game in the class, it's never going to go that well. Students are learning, they're trying to figure it out, what's going on. So that first time you do it, just let it happen. It's a big group, it's going to be a little noisy. There's an author, Ken Bain, he says, good teachers balance the systematic and the messy. And so, there are going to be times where you lose control during gameplay. Accept that. And then the second time you play the game, students will have figured it out a little bit more. They're going to know what's happening. The third time you play it, they know the rules, they know what they're supposed to do, and they can get right to it. So, don't be afraid if it gets a little out of control and you don't have control over every single group. It'll happen eventually. Give it that practice. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, very well. Thank you very much. And another question is is there any difference between gamifying and game-based activities?
Ooh, we could do a whole separate session. We could do a whole other webinar on that question. You know, there is so there's gamification. Now, I'm sure many teachers have heard about gamifying or gamification, you know, and that's slightly different. You know, okay, so we have a game. I'm going to use a game in my class. That game has what we call mechanics, you know. So a mechanic is the rules of a game. You know, students roll dice, or they, you know, answer questions, those sorts of things. And what we do with gamification is when we take those mechanics out of a game and we apply them to a real situation. You know, we apply them to a classroom, for instance. So, you know, like a gamified class will often use the characteristics of a game without maybe actually using a game in the class. And I think a great example of this is what we talked earlier about with rubrics. So in a traditional class, I may have a multiple choice test. My student takes the test and they get a 75 out of 100. They get a 75%. Done. In a gamified class, what we could do is give students maybe a chance to keep improving, right? So student takes an assessment and they get a 75, but they get their rubric, or they get even just a number, you know, a 75% again. And we say, hey, you know, this gamified class, you can try it again and try it again until you get it right. So maybe we give students 3 chances on a quiz. And if they can, you know, improve their score, the highest score is the one that we accept. That's more gamified, right? Where we're giving students more chances to make mistakes, learn from those mistakes, and improve. It's challenging to do well in the classroom, you know, but I think it's worth it. So, yeah, it's a good question.
So we are like, actually, we don't want to take much of your time. So there are like 2 questions. Let's make them like the last 2 questions.
Okay.
Let me ask them like to you at once. So one of them is like, how can we use games for assessing student learning? And the other one is like, how the games can be adapted to students' level or age.
You know, I think with the idea of assessment, you know, it's assessing students during gameplay, I think is very difficult for a couple of reasons. One of the challenges is with games, there is the notion of cognitive load. So, you know, as I'm playing a game, I'm thinking about what I'm doing. Okay, so I'm going to do this. And then if Yusuf does that, Samad's going to do that. And then I have to do this. So we're thinking, and then I have to do it in another language. That's really difficult. So during gameplay, students will often slip into native language. You know, this is easier for me if I just do it all in Turkish. So if we're analyzing students during gameplay, they're often thinking about something else. It may not be the language and it may not be the assessment. So instead, you know, thinking about the output of what the students are doing. If you can make the output of what they're doing the assessment. Okay, so we all played a game. Now that we've played it, I'm going to write a game review. You know, so I actually go online and read about game reviews, look at some examples, and we write some. Now it's just a writing activity. It just happens to be about that game. And now students got a little more time to focus on their language, focus on their correctness of their language. Much more, you know, effective way to, you know, assess the students because they're getting to focus solely on the language. You know, what we saw earlier with James York's idea of recording students during gameplay and then having them do grammar correction, grade them on that grammar correction component because again, it gives them more time to focus on the language because there's less cognitive load. Yeah.
Okay, so the other one is like adapting games to do students' levels or ages.
Yeah.
Practical, maybe one practical, like it will not be enough, but like maybe the most to the point strategy for this.
You know, lower the student's language ability, the less rules the game should have. You know, just because again, that load. And so if you can kind of keep the game pretty simple so they can really focus on language, it's helpful. But as your students advance, as their language gets better, give them more complex games. You know, that can really help. You know, and so again, you know, changing the vocabulary. You know, if the game uses a word like I don't know, strategy, you know, we might for lower level students make a plan. So changing out some of the language can also be really helpful so they can understand it a little easier without as much support. So changing up vocabulary can also be really helpful.
Exactly. Thank you very much. And finally, because this, like, I think it's like interesting one. How do you distinguish activity from a game?
That is a really good question. Okay, there's thousands of research papers arguing that question out there. And so I really like Abdulbaki's question because, you know, the argument, I'll keep this short, but I promise you I could talk all day on this. The argument really is, you know, games are voluntary. We choose to play games. So if I use a game in my classroom, the students don't really have a choice. They have to play it. It's no longer a game. It's an activity, right? But I do think it really comes down to like, if you think about a traditional classroom, you know, like you roll dice and you move your piece and you answer a question, right? What I like to say is count the verbs in your game. So if I do a traditional kind of like board game, I roll the dice, 1, 2, 3, I answer that question. Count the number of verbs that your students have. Okay, so I'm going to roll, I'm going to answer. So I have 2 verbs in that game. That's a really simple activity. And so sometimes our students will say, you know, well, this game is kind of boring. What they really mean is there's not enough verbs to keep them interested. And so I think when we think about a game in the class, really kind of take stock of the number of verbs. Like, so there's a video game called The Sims, for instance. So in The Sims, I can shop, I can work, I can meet people, I can go to the movies, I can, you know, work. There's all these verbs that you can do in that game. More advanced students and students who like games, you know, can handle 7 to 10 verbs in a game. So I like to say, you know, very simple, direct answer to this question, which is a long question to answer, but the more verbs you have can separate out an activity versus a game. Oh, yeah, you all have great questions. I'm digging these questions. They're all very theoretical, you know. Oh, this is gonna be a fun workshop series. There's some work cut out for us here with this crowd.
Well, I mean, like, there are like a few more questions. One of them is like, again, about the classroom management, which I think you already like mentioned, and like things to pay attention when choosing a game. And like, it's again like a very broad question, I believe.
Yeah, and you know, I see like, you know, encouraging students to take part in games. You know, often, and I think that's a great question. If you have to get your students to take part in the game, it's probably not a good game. But if your students really start to play, and I think my last piece of advice, I promise I'll shut up talking about games. Games are iterative. And so I really recommend, you know, as a teacher, if you create a game for your class, have the students play it once and let them give you feedback. It can be a great activity after games. Hey, I'm making this game for us. What do you think? What would you change or what would you improve? And then play it again, because the more engaging a game is, students will just naturally want to participate. And so if students are struggling to engage with your game and they're not really liking it very much, use that as a chance for them to improve it. I think that can be really helpful to make your game stronger.
And I think, like, let's make it really the final question. If there is no like technology in the classroom, what to do? What kind of games then can be chosen.
There's a very famous game designer named John Carmack. He made Doom. He made a bunch of video games way back in the day. And he said, if it's not fun on paper, it will not be fun digitally. And I think, you know, with a little bit of research, you can find almost every video game or high technology game is based on some sort of paper-based game. Try to find that game. There's lots of resources online. There's lots of communities. And I hope, you know, teachers in this working group can also help with that. But there's a paper-based version of that game. I use a lot of technology in my class, but I also have a bag with dice, chips, paper, markers in it where we can just kind of use paper-based, because you never know. And often those paper-based games can be a lot more fun because the students can customize it a lot more. So I know it's a short answer, but.
Yeah, but definitely, you're definitely right. Like even like some simple like roll cards and distributing them around and like asking them to do role play. Even that like does not include technology, but like students, like especially younger learners, like they love it.
Yeah.
So Jeff, thank you very much. It was wonderful. Also, thank you very much for the participants and for their great contributions with the questions. So again, like we hope to see you again, hopefully with another webinar.
And thank you guys for hosting this. And thanks for everyone for staying up late with us and learning about games.
Have a good night, everybody, and have a good day for you, Jeff.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, for your contribution. It was great to have you.
I'll see everybody soon.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Jeff.